Hi friends, and welcome to a new weaving video. Something a little bit different today, but something that a lot of people do ask me about is how to read a weaving draft for a Rigid Heddle loom. Well, weaving drafts are not something that Rigid Heddle weavers typically use on a day-to-day basis. They are something that certainly can be used, but most of the time you'll find that Rigid Heddle weaving instructions are just that, instructions, without the actual draft included. So today we're going to have a look at how to read a simple weaving draft. This is the draft that we're going to be going over. It is a simple 2-shaft draft because the Rigid Heddle loom is a 2-shaft loom. Now, I always say that as a Rigid Heddle weaver, especially if you're just starting out, you absolutely do not have to know how to read a weaving draft. However, it can be really useful. The two main reasons for that being it helps you to gain an understanding of how your loom actually operates. So understanding a draft and being able to set up a pattern will really show you how your loom works, and you'll be able to get to know it better. And the second reason why it's helpful is that a lot of people who start out with a Rigid Heddle loom go on to want to weave with more shafts. Now, this is not the case for everybody, and if you're happy to just continue weaving 2 shafts on your Rigid Heddle loom, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But a lot of people do look for something a little bit extra after a while, whether that is moving onto a table loom, or whether it is moving onto a floor loom, or whether it is trying to weave with more shafts on your Rigid Heddle by using pickup sticks, heddle rods, extra heddles, and all of that good stuff. So if you want to be getting into those sort of things down the track, then knowing how to read a weaving draft will make things so much easier for you when you get to that stage of being ready for more shafts. Now, this draft is available on my blog as a printable PDF, and I've also included a fabric view picture for you there on the PDF as well, and you'll find that over on my blog. I'm going to leave the direct link in the description box down below. I also wanted to mention that if you are a beginner weaver, or if you are a Rigid Heddle weaver lacking a bit of confidence, next week, the very start of February 2021, I'm opening up my weaving bootcamp for the first round. And if you would like to know more information about that, I'll also leave a direct link to a page down below that will give you a lot of information on what the bootcamp actually is and what you can expect to learn if you participate. Now, I have chosen some really bright and contrasty colours here for my draft, so I hope that's not playing havoc with your poor old eyes, but I wanted to highlight the difference between the warp colours and the weft colours, and purple and yellow certainly do that. Before we go any further, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to visit my online weaving school. I have the option of memberships or single purchase classes there, and there's so much to choose from for all different levels, and I'm also going to leave the link to that down below. Alright, without further ado, let's get into looking at the sections of this draft and how we can actually decipher it. So the first part to look at is the threading, because when we get to the loom, we get our warp on the loom, or even before we get the warp on our loom, we need to know how many ends we're going to have and all of that. And the threading comes into that, especially with more complicated patterns. So the threading section is at the very top of the weaving draft. Now, this is not always the case every single time, but with most modern drafts it is. You may have some older weaving books or some older weaving drafts, or you may see them on the internet, and you might notice that the threading is down the bottom, and that things are just jumbled around a little bit. They're still completely decipherable, but just in a slightly different format to what I've got here, which is the modern format. So if you have a look, starting at the right hand side, because we do read weaving drafts from right to left, so we go right over the right hand side of all of these 1, 2, 1, 2 numbers up the top, and the very first number on the right hand side in the top bar is a 1. You'll also notice that with each number there is a corresponding color at the top of that, and this is just a really straightforward solid colored warp, and I've done purple for the warp. So you can think of all of these numbers up here as your warp threads that are running vertically on the page. So why do we have the numbers 1 and 2, 1 and 2 repeating at the top? Because a rigid heddle loom is a 2-shaft loom, and we can achieve shaft 1 and we can achieve shaft 2. So that's why we have 1, 2 repeating over and over. That is the entirety of your warp for whatever width you want to thread it for. An easy way to think of it is that the holes on your heddle are shaft 1 and the slots on your heddle are shaft 2. Now some people, you may sometimes see a pattern where the designer has used the opposite, so they've used the holes as shaft 2 and the slots as shaft 1. I always use holes as 1 and slots as 2 for my patterns. I find that the easiest way to think about it. But yes, the basic idea is that we have 2 shafts to work with. So on this page I've actually circled the starting point for reading the threading draft. So you can see that I've circled that number 1 in the right hand corner, and that's where we start reading the threading, and from there we just go along to the next number. The next number in order is number 2, and then following that number 1, then number 2. And as I said, all of the warp threads are going vertically, so everything that's purple is a warp thread. And this is also just a reminder that we are reading the threading from the right to the left all the way across. Now, if you take a look on my blog, I actually have this laid out a little bit better. I have shown the tie-up box on its own, but I've neglected to do that here. So make sure that you check out the blog post as well to have everything really laid out in a good sequence for you. The tie-up box is the box up in the corner on the right hand side, and you can see that it's got 2 circles in it. One's on the left hand side down in the bottom box, and one's on the right hand side in the top box. The circles usually on a weaving draft will indicate that it is a rising shed draft, and if they are X's, that usually means it's a sinking shed shaft. So we're using circles today. And these are basically for table or floor loom weavers to show you which shafts need to be tied up to your treadles or to your levers in order to weave the pattern. Now you can see here on the left hand draft, on the left hand picture of the draft, I've circled the first circle from the tie-up box along with some of these number 1 numbers, which indicate shaft 1, just to show you how the tie-up box lines up with the shafts. And then you can see on the right hand side that I've circled the right circle at the top, and I've circled along that row just to show you that that particular circle lines up with the shaft 2. So what relevance does the tie-up box have to rigid heddle weavers? Well, it just shows us that we need to engage certain shafts in order to be able to weave our pattern, and it shows us what those shafts are going to be. So in our case, it's still shafts 1 and 2, and if we've threaded our loom with alternating holes and slots, then as the rigid heddle loom, we don't need to actually do anything further at this point. Whereas if I was on a multi-shaft loom, I would be tying up. Okay, so the long vertical box here at the side is called the treadling box, and you'll notice that each number here has a yellow square next to it, and the yellow square is our weft. So even though this box goes vertically, it's actually showing the horizontal weft threads. If you go to the very top and look at the first number that comes underneath one of those circles, which is our tie up, it shows us what it expects us to do first. So because on the rigid heddle loom we operate the heddle for plain weave by either lifting the heddle or by placing it in the down position, The first box says number 1 and it's underneath the number 1 tie-up box. So for this weaving draft, that means that we need to engage shaft 1 first, and on the Rigid Heddle loom that means we will be lifting up the heddle into the up position. So when we lift the heddle into the up position, what we're doing is all of the threads that are threaded on holes on the heddle are lifted up, and the threads that are threaded on slots stay down, and that creates the space or the shed in which we weave. So we pass our shuttle and we beat, so we've woven that pick, and then we go to the next box down and it says number 2, and it also corresponds with the circle that represents the second shaft up in the tie-up box. And so when we put our heddle in the down position, which is our shaft 2, it does the opposite of what we just did before. The hole threads now go down, which makes the slot threads pop up, and then we have another shed to weave through, and that's our shed 2. And so we're just repeating that over and over. You see the next box down is a number 1, the next box down after that is a number 2. That's just our up and down positions of our heddle that we weave over and over in order to weave plain weave. So as a basic rule, if you have your shaft 1 threads threaded in holes, then heddle up means shaft 1 is engaged, and if the heddle is down, then shaft 2 is engaged. So here I've just put in an extra picture to show you how each pick that we weave, each time we engage these shafts, that it corresponds with the circle above. And when we begin our first part of weaving, we always start at this top corner and work our way down. Now you'll see that in this treadling section that I've put the numbers 1 and 2. Sometimes there won't be numbers, there will be a diagonal slash, or there might be a filled in box. And as long as you've got the slash or the box is lined up with the circle above to show you which shaft you're engaging, that's fine. Another thing that you might also see in drafts is that rather than having a number that represents each shaft, as I do, 1 and 2, there might be just a number 1, and then some of the boxes might be filled with another number, like say the number 3, and that would mean that you would weave that same pick 3 times. So you see this a lot in drafts like overshot. It's not really going to happen in a plain weave draft if it's a balanced plain weave, because we just go back and forth with our heddle up and down. And then also here I've just got circled or highlighted the fact that the number 2 lines up with the second circle in the tie-up box. Now the last part of the weaving draft that we want to have a look at is the drawdown. This whole checkerboard represents our fabric, and it's really a diagram to show you the interlacement of threads. So you can see that all of those purple threads line up with warp threads, and all of the yellow threads are the weft threads, and they're interlacing one on one on one on one. Now your fabric, your finished fabric, won't necessarily look just like the drawdown. It is dependent on things like set and yarn thickness that you use and the item that you're weaving. And also, of course, this is like a computer visualization, so it's not going to be an exact representation of the reality of your fabric. But I do have here over on the right a little indication of how your plain weave might look if you followed this draft and if you had a balanced plain weave. The drawdown can be really useful just for getting an idea of how things might actually look once you're done. If you're interested in knowing more about weaving drafts, I do have quite a bit of material at my online weaving school. I have 2 members only classes on. One is an introduction to reading weaving drafts, and the other is reading a 2-shaft plaid draft for rigid heddle weavers. And I also have a lot of classes like convert 3 and 4 shaft drafts to your rigid heddle loom, and a lot of the other classes there do use weaving drafts as well. And I show you all different ways of setting your loom up in order to be able to weave those more complicated drafts. There's so much that you can do in weaving, there's so much that you can do with your rigid heddle loom. But if things like weaving drafts are overwhelming to you and leave you shaking your head, my advice is just don't worry about them. I always say that if you can follow the instructions and get the results, then you don't really need to understand what you're doing. Yes, it can be helpful to understand, and certainly from a design perspective, in designing your own things, you need to know a lot more. But if you're just starting out, just get some instructions to get you started, get you going, and remember to have fun with it. You certainly don't need to worry about the more serious stuff if it stresses you out. All right, friends, don't forget to check out the blog post. All the links that I mentioned will be down below for you. I hope this video was helpful to you, and until next time, happy weaving.